Hello! Today I'm continuing a celebration of Final Fantasy VIII and discussion of the greater and lesser characters of the game with a look at the intriguing and lesser discussed mentor figure of Headmaster Cid. Now, kicking off with a slightly odd and subjective observation of Cid, when I first played the game, I instantly took a liking to him, as I'm sure many did, as he was this affable, fatherly and strangely familiar character. And I couldn't put my finger on precisely why that was, until literally last year someone mentioned to me how Headmaster Cid has an uncanny resemblance to Robin Williams. And indeed, it was even mentioned recently in the comments of my Seifer Almacy episode. And without even consciously realising it, although apparently everyone else has, this was exactly how I'd always felt. And I'd basically always viewed Cid, in both appearance and demeanour, as the affable, good-natured sort of character that Williams portrayed in those childhood films, which are around the time of Final Fantasy VIII's release, such as, Mrs. Doubtfire, Flubber, Jumanji. And looking back, even the slightly more mature features, such as Good Will Hunting, which, again, slightly precedes Final Fantasy VIII, and saw Williams portray a wise but slightly flawed mentor figure, much like how we might perceive Headmaster Cid. And whether or not this was a conscious design decision on the part of Square, I wouldn't be surprised if several gamers in the latter 20s to latter 30s age range today, who played Final Fantasy VIII upon release, and would have watched Robin Williams movies in their childhood, I wouldn't be surprised if they also make this connection with Cid on some level, whether it's conscious or not, because as soon as the penny dropped for me, I just couldn't unsee it. So, moving on from this slightly odd preamble, I think while Cid is somewhat less discussed than central figures such as Squall, Rinoa and Laguna, I think his contributions to the game are quietly significant, and he has his own small reveals and development, which chips away at the stereotype of a wizened mentor to show a slightly more flawed and naive man than we initially expected, which is a rare occurrence for this character type across Final Fantasy, and wider examples of the monomythic hero's journey. As we begin Final Fantasy VIII, Cid is an authority figure. He briefs us on the Dole mission and the importance of our coming-of-age Cid exam, and he speaks of honour, hope and victory on the battlefield. Upon our return, he also appears to chastise Seifer's impertinence and graduates us into the ranks of Cid. So he's something of a fleeting and absent man, which makes his presence and his dialogues all the more intriguing when we do see him. And, of course, he sees us off on our first official Cid mission in Timber, and, owing to his fleeting appearances, this is the last we see of him for the remainder of the first disc of the game. So, unpacking our first impression of Cid, it's interesting to see how a couple of set pieces are laid down for the momentous events that occur in Disc 2. Firstly, between Quistis and himself, he seems to be the stereotypical mentor theorised by the academic Joseph Campbell in his idea of the monomyth. He sets the hero on the first arc of his adventure, and he hands him special artefacts to assist him, in the form of the magical lamp, which of course contains Diablos, and the bonus battle meter, if you speak to him following your graduation ceremony. Beyond this, however, we see inklings of future developments from Cid through his surrounding actions and relationships. Firstly, despite his relative absence, he makes time to address Seifer directly following the Dole mission, and also personally briefs Squall prior to the Timber mission. And I think these two cases hint at the not preferential treatment per se, but the aptitudes he acknowledges both Squall and Seifer to have, and the faith that he has in them to reach positions of leadership, or at least some degree of potential that he sees them to have. As I mentioned in my Seifer episode, Seifer is the leader of the Disciplinary Committee, and he recurs in his role as a Squad B captain. And I argued that this is not an accident, and that Cid actually sees great promise in Seifer, that unfortunately this guy's temperamental nature never allows him to live up to. In a similar fashion, in the briefing for the Timber mission, Cid names Squall as the squad leader, placing him in a position of responsibility that he believes this potential protégé can also live up to. And it also foreshadows the later curveball of Squall succeeding Cid as the leader of Garden. More interestingly, in our fleeting interactions with Cid, we see inklings of Disc 2 events through the passive-aggressive dialogues with those looming and somewhat freaky Garden faculty members who consistently materialise to undermine him and usher him away. In two key scenarios, namely when Cid is trying to reconcile with Seifer and when he's trying to brief Squall, a faculty member stunts his conversation and Cid is forced to depart without delivering what would perhaps be a more compassionate side of his thoughts. So, this is a great prologue to the events that unfold later, and fast forwarding to Disc 2, following the Timber mission, the assassination mission, and escaping the Galbadian prison, our adventure finally returns to the perceived sanctuary of Barlam Garden, only to find students and faculty running amok in a sort of civil war, attempting to overthrow Cid. And all of this is occurring with the threat of a missile strike looming overhead as well. When we discover Cid in his office, Squall, and perhaps the player, begins to see his weaknesses become apparent. His tenuous grasp on power has resulted in the Garden faculty attempting to overthrow him, and during our conversation he slumps to the ground in a moment of physical weakness that mirrors his diminished authority and declining image as a leader. Squall's thoughts show doubt in his headmaster for the first time, owing to the slightly pathetic figure that now Cid appears to be, and the fact he's opted to hide in his office rather than lead, an attempt to restore order. In an act that foreshadows Squall's later transition to leadership and succession of Cid, he offers to take the headmaster's place in discovering the secrets of Garden, and at this point, we go into the basement and discover its maneuverability and save everyone from the missile strike. But Cid is further developed following this sequence in one of the most bizarre reveals, but actually quite telling aspects of his character, which is the discovery of and the confrontation with Barlam Garden's hidden benefactor, which is Master Norg. Now, what we find here is that Cid's conduct thus far and his infrequent clashes with faculty members owes to the divided objectives and personalities between him, Norg, and his staff. From the moment we see him, Cid is a man of compassion, and he advocates this quite strongly. For example, in his dialogue with Seifer, he states that he doesn't want his students to become mere machines, but rather they should think and act for themselves. By contrast, we see the Garden faculty, and by extension Norg, exclusively concerned with earnings and the financial return for Cid's endeavours. One of them quips that Duke Dole should have paid a bit more money if he wanted further assistance from Cid, and likewise, as we set off on our mission to Timber, they chastise Cid for the tiny fee he has accepted from Renoa for undertaking that Cid mission, which explains why only 3 members of our party are being dispatched in that instance. The Norg sequence brings this conflict to a head, and we discover that Cid, who was only able to establish Barlam Garden in the first place, owing to Norg's financial backing, which explains why the faculty are so concerned with number crunching and a solid return for the Cid missions, because of course Norg wants to see a return on his investment. The compassionate side of Cid is highlighted here because as we enter the basement, we hear him arguing with Norg, calling him a money-grubbing SOB, and highlighting that Cid wasn't just founded to make money, and so on. And once again, I think seeing him manhandled by the Garden faculty as he is in this scene, and shortly thereafter, we find him crying in the infirmary, once again just shows the obvious weakness and lack of authority that Cid is actually revealed to have, and how he so radically departed from the first impression that we might have had of him. So, this point in the game also reveals a slightly more duplicitous side to the subtle Rubik's Cube that is Cid Kramer, and I always felt that he plays things a little close to the chest, for good or ill, when it comes to the events surrounding Garden. He's aware Garden has hidden secrets that others are unaware of. He's done a hasty deal with the devil to fund Garden, and has been housing this weird benefactor in its basement all along. We soon discover that he's married to sorceress Edea. He established Cid to stop her, and he was a foster parent to the main party, for the entire time. I also think the way Cid hastily forces Squall into a position of leadership by announcing it over Garden's intercom without, asking him, was also, if not outrightly duplicitous, then at the very least kind of a dick move in my opinion. And just relating back to the part where Cid collapses after stating he's going to access Garden's secret basement, I can't help but wonder if he did this purposefully to once again force Squall to take his place and move into this position of responsibility. Because we don't really see this convenient act of weakness repeated in the game. But that's merely an observation I made on a recent playthrough. And I suppose to argue against the points I've just made, a lot of the stuff that Cid keeps secret couldn't really be outrightly disclosed to people. And regarding Squall moving into this position of leadership, he's so introverted and at odds with the public-facing expectations of leadership at this point. It arguably took a curveball announcement like this to make him fulfill these expectations anyway. So that's a potential argument in Cid's favour there. So Cid's main arc in the game concludes with this passing of the torch to Squall and co. He's delighted when Edea's powers are passed on, and he hastily rejoins her at the orphanage to build their lives together. And I suppose as an NPC whose significance ebbs after Disc 2, it's probably for this reason that he's not really discussed so much specifically. But as we've explored here, I always found him a great catalyst to the action at the beginning of the game, who ushers us forward into our adventure, and his flaws, much like Squall's introversion, Seifer's temperamentality, and Laguna's buffoonery, make him a much more human and relatable character. And the side quests, such as Norg, the hidden Barlam basement, Fisherman's Horizon, and of course the Timber mission, are all prompted by Cid's decisions and actions and personality, which actually make him a real interesting player and aspect of the story early on. Before wrapping up on Cid, something I alluded to in my Seifer episode was this rumour that surfaced once or twice about him and Edea being Seifer's parents. The evidence for this has been argued by Cid placing Seifer in positions of responsibility that he hasn't necessarily earned, and the fact that Seifer's character card can be obtained from Cid, much like Squall's card being obtained from Laguna, and Renua's card being obtained from Caraway. And while I think the fated, multi-generational leanings of Final Fantasy VIII's plot and its focus on ties between past and present would make this a very neat subtlety to sit alongside Squall and Laguna, for example, I've never been able to commit to the idea, owing to the difference in appearance between Seifer and Cid and Edea, the difference in their respective family names, of course, which is Kramer and Almacy, and basically the lack of further evidence or allusion that's given to us in-game. Although, amusingly, I did notice on a recent playthrough that when Cid is disciplining Seifer following the Dole mission, he begins to sympathise with him a bit, and says the phrase, "I am," before getting cut off by one of the faculty members. And owing to Square's infatuation with Star Wars, I always wondered if this was alluding to the phrase, "I am your father," which, I doubt, but I thought it was funny to consider and notice, nonetheless. And on the note of this perhaps preferential treatment with Seifer, and the fact, of course, that you get Seifer's character card from Cid, I put it more down to the fact that Seifer is such a problem child that perhaps he never got an adoption that worked out. So he ended up being raised by Cid and Edea, regardless, and that's how he found his way to Barlam. So there we have it. Quite a minor character, but Cid is the compassionate to a fault and flawed father figure of Final Fantasy VIII. He provokes action and story early on, and is a great contributor to the mood and setting of Barlam Garden, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts on him? Do you get the Robin Williams vibes, and did you notice them right away? And finally, if you're into Final Fantasy VIII and would like to hear my extended thoughts on the game, please check out my Final Fantasy VIII review, which is available on the channel, although it's quite old, and I'll place a link for that in the description. And as always, feel free to drop a comment, start a conversation, and hit like, hit subscribe to keep updated with my latest posts.